Hi everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining our Offsite Procurement Lunch and Learn. I'm joined today by Jamie Hillier, who I'll be handing over to shortly. Just first, a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any issues, we'd recommend logging off and then rejoining, or there are dial-in options in the emails that have been sent to you. If you have any questions throughout, we'd really encourage you to put them in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. Please just drop your questions throughout. We'll answer them throughout, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. We'll be recording the session, and we'll also ask for your feedback right at the very end. So Jamie is a partner of the Supply Chain School, and he now leads Akerlof, a consultancy specialising in offsite solutions. He was formerly pre-construction director at a Tier 1 contractor and MMC lead for the UK's largest regional contractor. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jamie.
Brilliant, thank you, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining. So, as Imogen's just described, today I'm presenting on behalf of the school, but in my capacity as partner of the Supply Chain School. But typically I work as a director at Akerlof, and we're consultants that specialise in offsite and modern methods of construction. So we provide services that extend from strategic advice to much more sleeves rolled up approach around implementation to clients, consultants, and the supply chain. And I think the slide you can see on the screen gives you a bit of an indication of the scale and types of projects that we work on. As Imogen's mentioned, my background was in Tier 1 contracting, and whilst many of the examples and references that I'll go through today originate from that perspective, they equally apply to wherever you sit along the value chain. So certainly for the next half an hour or so, you're going to be hearing from me talking to you around the subject of procuring offsite solutions. And as an introductory piece, I wanted to cover and ensure that we're aligned on some of the real fundamentals, but equally throw in a few other bits as we go through. So I think, as Imogen described, she's going to keep an eye out for me in terms of that chat function. So please raise as many questions as you'd like. I'll try and respond to them as we go through. But as she said, there is some time at the end. Either way, I hope that at the end of this lunch and learn session, you'll leave with a headline understanding of offsite solutions, an understanding of how procuring offsite differentiates from procuring traditional construction works. And doing so, we'll do so through review of a couple of basic but fundamental principles and personal experiences that I can chuck in. And I thought it would be good just to begin by challenging the perception of what offsite solutions can look like. And this picture is from the Cambridge Mosque. It tests exactly that in my mind. How offsite's components can look like, particularly when they're developed to overcome complex challenges of logistics and assembly. And I think if you look at this slide, it's really difficult to differentiate between what is been constructed off-site relative to what has been built on-site, and that's exactly the way it should be. Off-site solutions should certainly enable aesthetic expression as much as any other form of construction does, but it should also deliver other benefits. And I'm going to talk through a number of these as we go through. Now, I think if we were typically looking at offsite solutions, what you can now see on the screen is probably more familiar to most. But I think what all of these images highlight, and certainly those ones that we've gone through previously, is that offsite can mean many different things to many different people in many different sectors and many different applications. So the variety of offsite solutions is broad in the same way, and that extends certainly into the types of language that we use. So before I go too far, I think I wanted just to outline a couple of basic definitions that I'm going to use today. Firstly, MMC, which you can see on the screen, and secondly, offsite manufacture. Now, as an educated audience, you might be thinking you already have a good knowledge base around offsite solutions. You might think that's very basic, and it probably is, but just reflect for a moment upon the range of acronyms, the descriptions, the different types of language that are used around the subject matter of offsite, and equally how that encourages, in turn, varying interpretation. We all use variations on a theme. I'm sure just through the course of this presentation, I'm sure I will. So one of the key steps, particularly in procuring offsite, is to ensure that there is consistency of understanding, being clear about what it is that you're going to buy. And if in doubt, I use a couple of tools. Firstly, I revert to the Bride and Wood model of classification, which you can see in the center of the screen, for classifying solutions, and it distinguishes between traditional from volumetric, from manufactured and componentized. And more importantly, and certainly more recently, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, have established the definition framework for offsite solutions. This again extends from one end of the spectrum, category 1 as it's classified. 3D primary structural systems is what the MHCLG call it, or in my language, volumetric. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, category 7, which is more focused around on-site efficiencies and improvements. But these are all the things I'm referring to are methods, solutions. And for me, it's a bit of a fundamental principle that we need to look beyond the method. But firstly, when we're considering offsite, consider the requirement. So Theodore Levitt came up with this particular quote, and for me, it's a really simple example that challenges us all in a procurement position to consider that question of what are we buying, but more importantly, why. So that, in the context of offsite solutions, is absolutely fundamental. We often investigate and get stuck into an understanding of the methodology, but in doing so, we absorb ourselves in that, which is quite natural. Modern methods construction, MMC, the methodology is intrinsic to it. But if we're not careful, we start seeing offsite as the output and not the enabler. So if there is one thing that I would recommend you to take away from this session, one of the fundamentals to consider is really a simple question of what is value and how do you define value? And I don't raise that to sound philosophical, ethereal, or abstract, but if we can understand the definition of value, then you can determine if and how where offsites are appropriate and how it will enable you to realize that value. And because offsite is the enabler, it is definitely not the means to the ends. It's the means to the end, not the end itself. So in advocating that for all of you, I guess I recognize that defining value is really hard, and particularly hard in an environment like we are now, where requirements are evolving and changing at pace. But equally, I think that evolving dynamics, especially over the last couple of months, illustrates the importance of the question of what is value, because it may well be that today managing a social distancing risk that previously didn't exist is now a requirement. Retaining productivity has suddenly become a prioritized requirement. Embodied carbon, again, not on the agenda 2, 3, 4 years ago, but certainly now is firmly on the agenda. And so to define what is value is absolutely fundamental. And offsite has currency today, given the pandemic, to deliver urgent needs and do so in controlled environments. And therefore has found its place because it is providing value. Now, you might hear of organizations such as the Construction Innovation Hub, the Construction Leadership Council, talking about themes challenging these principles that I've just described, like procuring for value, such as reviewing better outcomes. And all of these principles are about ensuring that when we buy, we consider what our end goal is, what our priorities, and what do we want to achieve. And asking all of these questions from a procurement perspective as a precursor to focusing in on cost is the order of steps. Now, that principle that I've just run through in terms of defining value and doing so before you review cost is pretty generic, and it applies irrespective of what you are procuring. I get that I'm outlining basics, but equally, experience tells me that those fundamentals are not always applied, and therefore I think they are definitely worthwhile of considering. And they're worthwhile considering because Offsite offers such a raft of benefits, and most of them have been talked about historically, and most of them are pretty widely accepted. But I think recognizing the breadth of solutions that I flagged, the raft of materials, methodology choices, picking what is then right for you and which of those benefits that are on the screen you wish to hone in on is then the next step. And in case this presentation didn't have enough cliches in it, for me, the next key fundamental rule that I run by is one of horses for courses. So whilst I work for a business that advocates offsite solutions, it has to be right for the circumstance. It has to deliver the value criteria that you've defined, the scope that you require, and it has to deliver the benefits and your business case. And I say that having worked on projects where we have successfully applied offsite solutions that accelerated construction of a particular building, which we all thought was absolutely brilliant. And we got excited about it and were very pleased, but that piece of work wasn't actually on the critical path, and therefore it didn't achieve our ultimate client any real project benefit. So again, a basic but worthwhile considering what it is you want to achieve, then assessing how the solution can realize that is absolutely fundamental. So the slide that I'm going to put on your screen, which I appreciate is probably not the easiest one to read, is an example of that, and it's an extract for some work that that we've done in conjunction with the Ministry of Justice, where we did exactly what I was describing. We identified our priorities. We set at high level a number of golden rules for the project. Delivering on time was pretty fundamental to that, and we used those golden rules, that determination and assessment of value, to apply against our technical solutions, such that we evaluated different types of frames. We assessed how it fitted relative to that, and then were able to select the horses for courses type approach, depending on what the building typology was, depending on what the needs were, and how it all fitted in. And again, it's a pretty simple premise, but I repeat my observation that quite often these basics are not undertaken. Too often we get drawn in with the attraction of the solution, whereas instead, in seeking to procure, we should just take the brief, define the goals, the requirements, and then select the right solution. And in doing so, that balanced scorecard of assessment of how the right solution fits with those needs to take cognizance of the risk profile and particularly your risk appetite. Now, NASA developed a number of years ago a system called technology readiness levels that evaluates how developed products and solutions are on a scale, and against that you can determine whether the technology is ready or not. And for companies that are pushing the boundary, that's an absolutely great tool to determine the risk profile of new technological solutions. But again, new technology needs to be balanced against the context of what an environment in which you're trying to apply it. And a slightly abstract but an example nonetheless that I refer to is the story of a German submarine or U-boat in the Second World War. And in those days, they had a particularly sophisticated pressurized toilet that the Germans had, through German engineering, had designed, as opposed to pretty basic storage tank that the Allied forces were using. But by its complexity, it needed certain operations and certain expert capability to operate it. However, the captain of the German U-boat decided that he was going to circumnavigate all of that, operate it himself, and consequently did so, which he got wrong. And as a consequence, he ended up flooding his own submarine with a cocktail of what turned out to be seawater, excrement. And once all of that had hit the batteries within the submarine. It then created lethal gases that meant the submarine had to rise, and it was attacked by the RAF. Now, a pretty obscure example, but it is one that highlights that when you are selecting new technologies, it needs to be placed in an environment that is appropriate. And in that instance, it was completely inappropriate. So when you are adopting forms of solutions, you need to consider not only what is theoretically right, but also the environment. And again, in terms of horses for courses, what is right for where it is being applied, but equally who is applying that. Now, again, as much as I will describe modern methods of construction as modern, there's an awful lot in offsite solutions that is not new. I'm sure you've heard many examples. The one you can see on the screen is from the Renkoy Hospital, which was delivered probably about 150 years ago. It was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and many of the real basic design fundamentals are consistent with plans that have then been applied in the last couple of months in designing the Nightingale hospitals that were built across the UK to a consistent standardized design through platform solutions. And to deliver that work certainly requires a different mindset, if nothing else, and a model that we apply, and the school has a very similar image that they use, is an illustration of an offsite mindset. And the offsite mindset is required because procuring offsite activities and offsite activities generally can certainly shift and alter the order in which things are conducted, and procurement really is integral and to the heart of that. So one of the key benefits I flagged earlier is that time and cost savings from being able to deliver faster is presented by offsite solutions. But equally, I guess the flip side of that is that it places greater emphasis on the front end for both design, but also procurement. And I think for me, procurement is quite often forgotten in that regard. So offsite solutions require preparation, it requires strategy, it requires forethought. And an area where I think this is particularly highlighted is by what's called the REBA DFMA overlay. If any of you haven't heard of this before or haven't seen it, then please, you can Google REBA DFMA and you can download it. And I know that there are copies and examples on the school's website. But in effect, a number of years ago, in fact, it was undertaken on the last REBA plan of work as opposed to the current one. REBA overlaid against their plan of work a number of activities that would be required in respect of offsite solutions or solutions that required design for manufacture and assembly, DFMA. And the area that you can see at the bottom, the blue line, is relating to procurement. And what the REBA overlay illustrated was twofold. One, it challenged design teams to consider design for manufacture and assembly, and therefore not only best as to how a building can be constructed, but how components of a building can be manufactured to aid the building process. So that was a fundamental mindset shift for the design team. But it also challenged all of us for procurement teams to develop models to facilitate and create changes in emphasis, roles, and activities. Pretty broad, but in plain language, it certainly challenged us to drive procurement early in the process. So early procurement engagement with design and procurement developing strategy side by side, which in turn poses a number of further practical questions around when to engage with the market, how best to engage with the market, what is our procurement strategy. Now, all of these questions that I've just chucked out there lead you back to the earlier point around how do you define value, because once you've defined value, you can then start to consider answers to around engagement, what is best value. But it equally all relies upon the formation of a team with the right skills and the right behaviours, and collaboration is the centre of that. Now, the appropriateness of early contractor engagement, particularly the timing and point of engagement, and as well as the ownership of design, is definitely different for offsite solutions relative to traditional. To what extent that applies will certainly vary and depend upon where your requirements and in turn the offsite solution that you select sits along the 7 categories and definitions of that MMC framework that I showed earlier. I'm equally mindful that the principle of procuring offsite solutions raises a number of question marks around it, whether that be relating to cost transparency and how you maintain competitive tension, particularly if you move to single action procurement process. There's question marks around the balance sheet and solvency of many offsite specialists and their capacity to assume risk. And equally, there's the theme that I talked about earlier around that shift in risk profile that arises not only from moving the location of the works from on-site to off-site, but also in reapportioning design responsibility. Again, the profile of all of that varies, not only depending upon the type of activity, but again, the project circumstances, the market context, which I think is particularly pertinent in the current environment, but also that tolerance and appetite to risk that you as procurers might have that I mentioned earlier. In principle, all of those individual scenarios are resolvable, but I think there's an awful lot that I've just chucked out there that require consideration. And I think the main theme that I would stress is that they require consideration at an early stage, a strategic stage for the project. And that's why they are certainly different to what might have otherwise been repeating the old, repeating the norm. Now, one of the projects that I was fortunate enough to be involved in was for the University of Cambridge. It was a project called Project Capella. And a couple of years ago, this won the winners at the Offsite Awards for fundamentally delivering a project from what was a blank sheet of paper to an enclosed building in less than 24 months. And all credit was really deserved for a collective team effort. But I think for me, the unsung hero as part of that team was the procurement team, who worked in close collaboration with the designers to develop a strategy that enabled other members of the team along the supply chain to be brought in at the appropriate time to do so in a forward-looking manner and addressing those challenges that I've touched upon by creating a plan that really related back to that fundamental of what is value. Now, I know that a theme that is emerging and certainly at the close heart of the supply chain sustainability school is one of social value, and procuring offsite solutions, as an example, distributes economic investment into areas of depravity and lower prosperity across the UK. What you can see on the screen is a bit of an overlay. You've got the highlighted and change of colours depending on how prosperous or poor those regions are, and equally there's the dots you can see are where a number of offsite manufacturers sit across the northern corridor. So you can see that there is an interlink, I guess, between a number of manufacturers sitting in areas that are less economically prosperous, and that by spending money in those areas, that provides an opportunity that links with the government focus on levelling up, and gives you an opportunity to distribute your spend, which in turn is another benefit that offsite can offer, and a much broader benefit than otherwise might appear. So I think I would reiterate that principle of looking at value and exploring how offsite can assist with that. Whilst many of us are focusing on offsite and the economical and technological aspects of it, and I am mindful as I've talked through, I certainly haven't mentioned the principles of contract that might be of interest to a number of you from a procurement perspective. The area personally I think has greatest impact, particularly for procurement teams, is a behavioural piece, or psychological, as it's shown on. And I think I say that recognising that probably 40% of decisions we make each day are not even decisions; they're born of habit. And so I don't underestimate the challenges for any of you that are working in procurement role, creating new habits. But equally, I can't understate your importance in enabling organisations and teams to deliver offsite solutions that can really realise those better outcomes that I mentioned earlier. So I'm mindful I've talked through and given you a pretty whistle-stop outline of a number of factors to consider in terms of procuring offsite. It is definitely by no means an exhaustive list. And I'm conscious that I haven't answered any questions as yet. We've skipped through it pretty quickly. So for the next 10 or 15 minutes, if anyone does have any questions or any topics you'd like us to pick up broader than the ones that I've mentioned, then please feel free to log them in the chat, and we can hopefully look to talk through them and answer any Q&A you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. That's really insightful. Again, as Jamie said, I'd encourage you just to put any questions that you have in the chat box. We'll answer them. A couple for the time being. In terms of the timescale of procurement, how is it different for offsite versus traditional? Do you need to start at an earlier stage? Are you involved for longer?
Yeah, I think the answer depends, Imogen, and I'm mindful that whenever you answer with the premise being it depends, it does sound like a politician's answer. But as I described earlier, the breadth of or variety of definition frameworks or definitions and types of offsite will mean that the magnitude of lead-in will flex to suit. I think the key thing is around that early strategic consideration, and therefore, if you are going for, let's take a category 1, which is wholesale volumetric, then undoubtedly, because you are building the majority of your works off-site, then you are shifting the location to a different place, and therefore you are undertaking more design at an earlier phase, and that requires early consideration. But I think if you map out, and this is why I revert back to the REBA overlay, if you plot those activities as you go through the different stages and consider what is appropriate at each and every stage, then you can create that time. But there is, if you are trying to shoehorn in an offsite solution at, say, REBA stage 4, when you haven't had that pre-consideration, then for me that would be inappropriate. It wouldn't meet the horses for courses test, and you probably haven't got sufficient time to lead-in time for it. So I think lead-ins definitely, lead-in durations are greater, but if you've got the forethought, the strategy, and the consideration, that doesn't necessarily mean that your program would extend as a consequence.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is around a balanced scorecard approach. Is it different for offsite or the same for traditional?
I think the principle of balanced scorecard is exactly the same. I think if it's going to be an appropriate balanced scorecard, then the consideration of what you put in that scorecard should be different in each and every occasion, and that shouldn't be determined exclusively by whether it is offsite or on-site. It should be bespoke to your project purpose, the circumstances of the project, and what you're trying to achieve. And it may well be that timing, as an example, is a priority, and that leads you to the offsite as the solution. But I wouldn't necessarily include offsite as a factor of that, unless you have a driver to do so. So certain government departments have a presumption in favour of offsite where it derives best value for them. They should be applying a balanced scorecard, and offsite should definitely be considered as a primary solution to that. Yeah, I would say if you start with a scorecard that is linked to your underlying requirements, Offsite would come in as part of your solution to meet that scorecard.
Great, thank you. The next question is around recommendations for assessing the offsite supply chain. So again, similar to the other questions, is that a different approach to traditional, or is it the same?
That's a good question. I think there are definitely nuances, but the fundamentals are pretty much the same. So if you are assessing, for instance, if you were reviewing a financial piece or a commercial piece around the robustness and solvency of your contractor, then you would evaluate it against very similar criteria. I think from a QA perspective, you would definitely want to undertake reviews. And again, I think because QA is a good example where understanding those processes, the rigor behind them, you would be doing that earlier in the process, and you would want to make sure that is very clear and understood. And what it does is creates different pressures upon you in trying to manage that, because instead of just managing the works on site when they arrive, you want to undertake that QA and assurance and that overview as part of your offsite activities. There are definitely differences and nuances between traditional and offsite. There's a lot of focus, particularly in the housing sector, around warranties, around assurance, and around guarantees, and that could be a real consideration that may mean that your profile of assessment may well be nuanced and slightly different in certain areas. But I think the basic underlying fundamentals are very, very similar. It's just how you assess them might be slightly different.
Sure, great, thanks. A question come in: have they applied offsite procurement to the HS2 project?
I think the answer to that has to be yes. Certainly, my understanding is, albeit I'm not directly involved in HS2, so I'm sure there'll be others that will consider that. I think HS2, from my understanding, is reviewing in a number of occasions principles of platform design, and what I mean by that is adopting standard, consistent solutions across the board, such that you can get replication in both the product that you are delivering, but equally the processes associated with that. So I think, in fact, one of the best examples I've seen around offsite solutions is in the infrastructure sector. It was around designing of bridges. If you took, going slightly off piece from HS2, but if you looked at your smart motorways, I think that's a great example of offsite solutions where the gantries are standardized across the UK. They've been manufactured offsite, so it's consistent design, consistent manufacture, consistent maintenance and operation. And I'm sure a number of those fundamentals will be linked in as part of the HS2 program, given its scale and given the benefits it would offer.
Brilliant, thank you. This is the final question that we have for the moment. So if anyone does have any burning questions, please do drop them in the chat box. So this final question currently is, in terms of beginners who are only just moving or considering moving into offsite procurement, do you have any recommendations for resources that they can look at or topics that they should kind of bury their head in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably get a slap from the school if I didn't obviously advocate all of the wealth of materials that are on the school, and I say that with genuinely, because I think there are some absolutely fantastic resources that are available. I think there are a number of pieces of information that you could read that would give you good insight into offsite solutions. There are a raft of reports, whether that be from McKinsey, or if I was advocating my own services on the Akerlof website, and we give links to some really interesting materials around offsite solutions. The pieces that I flagged as we went through the presentation, whether that be the DFMA overlay that REBA have produced, the definition framework, which you can find if you Google MHCLG and an MMC framework. And there are plenty of others, but I would say the school is a really good example of materials, and I would say take it slowly and read and learn. I think there are lots of terms, as I mentioned earlier, that are interchangeably used. Lots of areas where knowledge is developing at pace, I would say. So I guess over and above looking and exploring some of those resources, I would equally encourage you, if you are at that learning stage and beyond, don't be afraid of asking the stupid question, because probably chances are different people are saying slightly different things. So.
Thanks. We've had another question come in. So does offsite procurement dramatically adjust the traditional project management S-curve for cost forecasts and predictability?
It definitely shifts the profile, yes. I think so. In terms of the S-curve from a financial expenditure arrangement, then yes, it does. If you're undertaking works earlier in the phase, then certainly that's going to move your S-curve, and that's not only in terms of construction, assembly, or manufactured goods, but equally those themes that I described around the pressure it places on your design activities, and as well as procurement. So, in the same way that BIM was advocated in terms of front-loading activities and shifting that curve, then it will certainly do that from an off-site perspective as well. I think you then have the commercial piece, and the best example I give for those that haven't necessarily dipped their toe too much into off-site solutions is probably consider a more typical example of, say, lifts. So when you procure a lift is manufactured off-site, probably somewhere in Europe, probably Spain or somewhere. You will go through and negotiate and agree to what extent you would pay for design, because the design responsibility often sits with the lift manufacturer. You'll review what you pay for in terms of off-site goods. You'll consider challenges around vesting, who has ownership and rights of the lift. You would consider inspecting those works, validating that it's been tested off-site, sending people across to review that, ensure that the due diligence has been undertaken before you bring it. You may well store it before you then consider how it is assembled on site. All of those challenges in something such as a lift is an on-site principle, an off-site principle that applies to many of the other areas that I've described, whether that be volumetric construction or off-site CLT construction, or a raft of the other examples. So yes, in terms of the question, it definitely impacts on the S-curve, but from a project management perspective, it really places an emphasis that all of the project management activities that you would ordinarily do on site, you're not only doing them in a different location, you are also being challenged to do them earlier in the process.
Brilliant, thank you. We don't actually have any more questions at the minute, so I think we'll close there. If anyone does have any other questions that they think of after this, please do drop me an email and I'll pass them over to Jamie. Thank you very, very much for joining, and also thanks very much, Jamie, for your insights today. It's been really helpful. We would just ask everyone to complete the very, very short 1-minute feedback form that will automatically pop up on your screen after this. It would be really great for us. So I'd just like to again say thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you.
Brilliant. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.